future. There are no people. There are no people in the future. No people at all. There are no people in the future. Where did all my people go? There are no people in the future. Let me try my people call. Where are all my people? Where are all my people? I guess I'll fly away now.
Hey, everybody, welcome. Yes, it is a Monday. You know what that means. Here we are on Out the Coop Live. Yes, it is Monday, March 21st, 2022. Welcome to Raging Chicken's Out the Coop Live. This is, of course, Kevin Mahoney, creator and founder of Raging Chicken. On Out the Coop Live, we talk to progressives, activists, and troublemakers of all sorts, right from our own backyards, from across the country. On our Friday show, of course, we break down the good, the bad, and the ugly in state and national politics. And check out the Wednesday show with Cyril Michaleko. Cyril is a progressive columnist from the Bucks County Courier-Times and the Intelligencer, and now, of course, also a columnist at the Bucks County at the Bucks County Beacon. There you go. Way to go, Cyril. That's a weekly column. It's fantastic. We got the progressive media blooming here in Bucks County. Each month, Cyril joins me to drill down into Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and international politics. You can get all our shows by subscribing to our podcast on Podbeans, iTunes, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast. And make sure, look, you're over there on your kind of Apple podcast. Leave us a review. Give us that 5-star review that helps everybody find the show. And you can help support this show by becoming a patron for as little as $5 a month. Head on over to patreon.com/rcpress. You can become a patron for as little as $5 a month or $10 a month. You know, it's like a good beer once a month. Come on. You know, a little support of progressive media. You can also help out the show by heading over to our YouTube channel if you're not there already. Smash that subscribe button, like the stream for this show, and hit that notification bell so you'll know every time that we go live. You can hop on our Discord server as well. Information on that is in tonight's show notes. And for more PA progressive talk, tune into the Rick Smith Show's live stream at 9 p.m. Eastern, his YouTube channel, Twitter, or Facebook. You know, anywhere you're going to find streams, you're going to find Rick at 9 p.m. Eastern. All right, subscribe to his podcast, wherever you get your podcast, and head on over to thericksmithshow.com for the latest across all his platforms, including his show at WBAI in New York, KPFK in Los Angeles. You get the idea. And if you haven't already, you got to check out Season 2 of the Sisters of the Night Caucus podcast. The amazing PA women stirring the political cauldron behind this podcast rock the house, and they know where the bodies are buried. You know, make sure to follow them on Twitter at The Night Caucus. That's at The Night Caucus on Twitter. And subscribe to their podcast on Anchor, Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you get your podcasts. Attention gamers, the Game In, that's with 2 N's. The Game In is a Quakertown-based black family-owned gaming store. They're friends of the show, and they've got everything from retro N64s to the latest consoles, video games for all platforms, collectibles, action figures, Funko Pops, you got it. And look, kids come in with A's on the report card, they get a discount. I mean, come on, you can't beat it. Check them out on their Facebook page, follow them at Twitter at The Game In. If you got a question about a game, look for something that's hard to find, shoot them a message or drop them an email at thegameinpa@gmail.com. And a special shout out goes to Jonathan Mann, who wrote our intro song, There Are No People in the Future. Check out all his great stuff on his YouTube page and follow him on Twitter at @SongADayman, again with 2 N's. That's @SongADayman on Twitter. Well, on tonight's episode of Out the Coop Live, I am thrilled to be joined by William Horne. William is an Arthur J. Ennis I always get this. You know what? Well, I had a trouble. When I was applying for postdocs, I had the same kind of thing. I could never get this word out of my mouth. Anyways, he's an Arthur J. Ennis postdoc. I'm just going to say postdoc because it's going to make it a lot easier for me. Fellow at Villanova University, who writes about the relationship between race to labor, freedom, and capitalism after the Civil War. He holds a PhD in history from the George Washington University and is co-founder and editor of the Activist History Review. He is also the co-editor with Nathan Wuertenberg of the book Demand the Impossible, Essays in the History as Activism. And we'll be talking about his recent article tonight in TruthOut called, quote, "The Legal Phase of Fascism Has Begun. Threats of White Vigilante Violence Are Real." And we'll also check out about how history provides little comfort if we expect recent uptick in white supremacy and authoritarianism simply to fade away by themselves. You can check out all his stuff with the links in tonight's show notes, his TruthOut article, and the direct link to the Activist History Review. Welcome to the show, William.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, well, it's great to have you. And I think, and like I said to you a little bit before we got on the air tonight, is like, well, I was thrilled to see your piece because these are issues that you raise in your article in TruthOut that we've been kind of digging into and having to deal with quite a bit here in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. But, just a little of that backdrop, if you look at Pennsylvania, we had the second largest number of individuals who went to the January 6th insurrection, right, in the country. And Bucks County, where I live, was the number one county in the state of Pennsylvania that sent people down there. And our school boards have been exploding. So to see your article, I think was, right on point, especially as we start looking forward to the midterms and actually organization and organizing kind of moving forward. But before we dive into that, give us a little sense of how you're kind of coming at this piece. Is this kind of like part of what you do in your research and so on? And then I want to talk a little bit about the Activist History Review before we jump into your articles. Give us a little kind of sense of your background and kind of what you're working on.
Sure. Absolutely. And I think that does give a good overview of, what it seems like is going on, not only in Bucks County, but, in a lot of our localities. Unfortunately, I've been in touch with a lot of people from school boards, even teachers who are dealing with threats on a regular basis. I was talking to one of my friends the other day. His partner is a nurse, and he was saying, like, they know a lot of nurses, right, that want to leave because of the anti-vax stuff, right? And I know a lot of teachers, right, who want to leave teaching, right, because we need these people, right? These are, truly essential workers as far as, the well-being of our society, right? And so I just want to say, shout out to all of our teachers here who are having to deal with stuff that none of us went to school to figure out or to sign up, for. It's a lot, right? But y'all are doing important work. So this piece is, I guess, kind of like an outgrowth of my research a little bit. So I do research white backlash movements and also Black liberation movements and the relationship between them. And so as I'm kind of observing, as many of us are, this white backlash that we are living through, right? Especially after the George Floyd protests, but also in the wake of President Biden's election. I'm thinking through these sort of earlier iterations of white supremacy and the racist laws that governed our country for the better part of a century after Reconstruction and through the civil rights movement. And I hear a lot of people say, we're a different country now, and we've moved on, or this sort of thing couldn't happen here or couldn't happen anymore. And that is 100% what people thought at the time that these laws were passed. During Reconstruction and Jim Crow, especially the Jim Crow era laws, very, very similar to the state level laws that we see restricting voting, restricting protest rights, restricting education. Very, very similar movements led by similar people, to be honest. I mean, the UDC, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, is involved in our so-called anti-CRT laws, just as they were involved in education suppression during the Jim Crow era. It's unfortunate to see. We've been here before. We do not want to go here again.
100%. And I think that, and I want to really dig into this too, because that is, I think, the key point that kind of, maybe kind of reach out to you here too as well in this piece. We're going to say, look, it's a cliche, right? We study history so we don't repeat the errors of the past,
Sure.
But here you go, right? I mean, one of the lessons that I think has to be learned front and center here is these things do not just fade away by themselves, right? And if you let them fester, right, they metastasize, right? And they only grow and they get stronger. But look, before we jump into it too, let me know a little bit. I mean, I've been kind of going through this journal now that you're also kind of co-founder and editor of, the Activist History Review. Can you tell us a little bit about that journal, what got it started and what you see as the focus of it?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, the goal is kind of similar to the piece that I wrote a little bit, in that, like, I'm taking something that we've, known and studied in the profession for a long time and trying to put it in a way that, people can understand, can engage with beyond, kind of this scholarly audience, right? And so the journal is meant to create a dialogue between communities, between activists, and between thinkers, right? Scholars and thinkers of all stripes, really. And so that's sort of the mission, I guess. The core mission of the journal is to think about ways that our scholarship can better inform our activism, and think about ways that our activism can better inform our scholarship, right? Because there's some disconnected nonsense going on here. And it's harmful, to be honest. and that's not the kind of thing that is going to give us a stable, better, more equitable world, right? And so we, are part of this much larger movement, right? To create and foster engaged scholarship, and that's really the goal in terms of our work.
Well, and I see this more and more, I think, especially with younger academics who are kind of coming up through here. It's like, I remember when I was kind of going on to my doctoral work in composition and rhetoric, was kind of the field that I was studying, is when labor issues were front and center, and a lot of it was happening there. So the old guard and the old school, it was still locked in the kind of monastic traditions of the academia, right? And we're coming out of here as kind of like watching the doubling of numbers of adjuncts or percentage of adjuncts, which only got worse since then. And having that kind of mentality, this really kind of labor focus of needed to have that as integral to what we're doing, and seeing scholars such as yourself now kind of coming up, really kind of embedded in a lot of these movements and connected with a lot of these movements, and seeing scholarship as, this kind of, like you said, right? I mean, scholarship informs the movement conforms a scholarship, and this becomes a symbiotic relationship, which I think is what all movements need. And, just to give a plug to this too, as well, is like, so folks, especially who've been listening to this show for a long time, if you look at some of the recent stuff that's come out in the Activist History Review, there's an article, Whitewashing and Power, Conservatives Enforcing Erasures and Censorship. Another one on We Need CRT to Understand the Midwest Too. That's a great piece on Toledo. Go check that out too as well. And Conflating CRT and Equity, School Board Members' Perspectives from the Front Line. If there couldn't be something more relevant than that to what has been happening right in our own backyards right now, I can't think of something. So do check out this work of the Activist History Review. It's excellent scholarship, and also part of the movement in my mind.
I appreciate that.
Oh, you got it. So listen, so let's dive into this. Now, just so people understand a little bit how you're coming at this, let me read the first paragraph of this, because I think, let's not beat around the, it's like, no punches, right? Here you go, right off the top. So when Republicans blocked the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act on January 19th, 2022, they removed the last safety net, preventing the U.S.'s plummet toward authoritarianism. As a result, we are at this moment in a state of free fall, the culmination of a state-level legislative and enforcement landscape that directly mirrors Jim Crow. Or, as fascism scholar Jason Stanley recently put it, quote, America is now in fascism's legal phase, unquote. Although we do have ways of fighting back, the situation is dire. I mean, I do think that you captured the gravity of where we're at right now. So take us through this piece a little bit about how you set it up, and look at some of these historical examples to shed light a little bit, at least on some of the dynamics that we're looking at today.
Yeah. And so one of the things that I, and many other observers who do similar kinds of work saw over the summer are very similar types of bills today passed by Republican state legislatures that we saw during the Jim Crow era. And the really important thing to take away here, I know we tend to think of Jim Crow as being in the past. One, it's not. It actually continues to shape the way that our Congress works, right? If you hate the filibuster, you actually hate something that is mostly an artifact of Jim Crow. Right? If you hate sort of the way that some of our courts work, or some of the tricks of mass incarceration, those were invented largely under Jim Crow, right? And so we have vestiges of this still with us, this horrible behemoth, even though it's now 120-ish years since it was solidified at the end of the 1890s. But what's really disturbing here, again, we're thinking about this at like the grassroots level, and I love the way you describe kind of the view from like Bucks County as being like, this is where activism is happening, right? Because that is where activism happened, right, during the Jim Crow era. And unfortunately, the white supremacists, white conservatives were able to pass a number of bills that kept Black Americans from voting. They had already used terrorist tactics to accomplish that in much of the Deep South. But there were pockets where Black men continued to vote into the 1890s. So famously, Robert Smalls, who I mentioned in the piece, he protests this legislation as an obvious attempt after a series of failed attempts to disenfranchise Black Americans. He was a formerly enslaved person, right? Helped passed laws in the state legislature, through the mid to late 19th century. And here he is, at the end of the 19th century, the end of the 1800s, being disenfranchised, being himself, restricted from voting with the majority of Black South Carolinians. The result of that was that in the 1960s, there were counties across the Deep South where there were Black majorities with 0 Black registered voters.
Right.
These laws were incredibly effective. And what that meant was that, there was no democratic way for activists to engage, right? And if we think about kind of the early civil rights movement, like we're talking about people putting their bodies on the line because they can't vote. They can't change the laws, right? And so we hear this mantra sometimes, like in white America, well, if you don't like it, right, then just change the law, vote for someone else, right? Wait for the next election. No, like that's not how that happened, right? That's not how we got to this point. And it's a very delicate thing, right? And so we have this unfortunate moment now that I do think mirrors the Jim Crow era, where, unfortunately, we are seeing sort of a push towards mass disenfranchisement. Again, a treatment of, in the case of the president, right, a Democratic politician as sort of just like intrinsically illegitimate. Doesn't matter how many people certify the votes, how many counties, right? It doesn't matter, right? Because at the end of the day, white conservatives consider those candidates, consider those policies to be simply intrinsically un-American.
100%. And I look at, a couple things in what you just said there. Like, number one is that there was this window, and I'm so glad that we're finally at a point where people are starting to shine a light back on Reconstruction and reclaim that period of history. Because I'll tell you, if this was something that was completely absent from my own education, right,
Same.
until kind of much later. And the fact that, scholars are now paying attention to Reconstructions as this moment in time when we had a shot. Right. I mean, there was a shot at a kind of truly multiracial democracy, and there were remarkable things that took place. And the important thing that I've been taking away from a lot of the work that's been coming out around Reconstruction has been Reconstruction was the utopian vision. I'll put small utopia on that one. It was, it was kind of like the looking out of that and say, we have an opportunity here to do something truly radical. Right. And truly kind of like multiracial democracy that would just kind of set a whole new standard. And it was there. It wasn't just an idea. It actually existed and was taking steps forward slowly, and it got rolled back. Right. And the fact that it got rolled back is also points to, it puts pressure upon this narrative that, the arc of history is always bending towards justice. Right. Sure. It doesn't bend towards justice on its own. Right. And I think you illustrate that really well in saying, like, look, the same kind of dynamics we have now were happening back then. And the white supremacists back then were as savvy in basically being very careful in couching what they were doing in non-explicitly racist language, right? As a way to get around a lot of the new laws, but to have an effect that was going to disenfranchise these folks. And the same dynamic, again, you draw that parallel really well in this piece, is existing now. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, it's incredibly dangerous when we think about like the span of time, right? That Jim Crow was in effect, and also what it took to dislodge Jim Crow, right?
Totally.
Yeah. And so this is something that we do not want to happen, right? But unfortunately, like this is also something that it does seem like the GOP is hell-bent on making happen at the state and local level by suppressing free speech, by passing these various voter restriction laws designed to make it much harder to vote, designed to make it a little scarier to vote, right?
Yes.
Designed to make it a little bit more frightening to go out into the street, right? Is someone going to run you over, right? Are you going to get arrested?
Which is now legal in Florida, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah. And so there are these states of heightened risk that make all of us think, twice before we do something like that. I taught in high school for a long time. I teach undergrad university now. And I think back to my time then and what it would be like to teach now under this sort of anti-CRT hysteria. And I'm going to be honest, like I had parents say some absolutely wild things to me after Barack Obama was elected. I started teaching in 2008, right? And like, whoa. And I can only imagine what teachers are dealing with now.
Yeah.
And to think about like, all right, well, what do I assign now, right? What do I say in class? Like, I don't want to wind up on the news, right? Nobody wants that, But at the same time, like, I think we're reaching a point, and I think many of us are realizing that, right? Some of us later to the game than others. I would include myself in that category, right? That if we don't do this thing now, right? If we don't like step up and, speak out and make a difference now, like it may be too late.
Absolutely. And so there's two examples that you've given here that I want to kind of dig into a little bit, because I think they do illustrate things very well. Like, can you tell that story about what took place in kind of Louisiana back in 1872? And I think we see the dynamic exactly as you were just describing it, and that kind of the creeping of violence, right? And the lack of consequences for, those perpetrators of that violence.
Yeah, that's right. And so this is the McHenry gubernatorial election in 1872. And essentially, like, nutshell version, what happened is the white conservative candidate refused to concede the election. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, unfortunately, right? And so what they wound up doing was creating a bunch of sort of like paramilitary wings. They created a sort of a shadow government, and
the White League. Right?
That's
the
exactly
White
right. They called it the White League. Yeah, they weren't very subtle. No points for subtlety, but definitely points for racist terrorism. They enacted that a great deal. They staged several unsuccessful coup attempts. And they eventually, because they are allowed to walk free after every coup attempt, they eventually sort of figured out a way to make it a successful coup attempt. And so in 1874, they do overthrow the state government. The U.S. Army comes in and restores the state government a couple days later, right? But I think this shows them, again, at the local level, all they have to do is remove office holders, right? And so they do that, right? And so they organize coup attempts now at the local level, at the county level, or in Louisiana we say the parish, right? But same thing. And they remove all the office holders. They kill a lot of them, right? There's a really famous massacre actually in North Louisiana, the Colfax Massacre, which is built on this model of removing local office holders and making it impossible for multiracial democracy to function, because there was no one cracking down on this. By the mid 1870s, the U.S. government had essentially kind of given up on enforcing its own laws, and so you get this really famous ruling actually in the wake of the Colfax Massacre that says essentially, and it's something I mentioned in the piece, that although maybe these massacreurs, right, the people who carried out the massacre, these white supremacists, maybe they were violating people's civil rights, but they were doing so as private citizens. And so violating someone's civil rights as private citizens doesn't violate the First Amendment to freedom of speech, doesn't violate the 14th Amendment, that guarantees citizenship rights, right? And so what winds up happening then is the Supreme Court itself rules essentially that the Constitution can't be applied to white supremacists engaging in white supremacist activity. Absolutely wild stuff.
So this is what's called, if I don't know how to pronounce this exactly. This is the 1876 ruling, the Cruikshank or the Cruikshank?
The Cruikshank, yeah.
The Cruikshank ruling.
Yeah.
I have to say to you, when I read that in the wake of what just took place in the Supreme Court, right, allowing kind of like basically abortion bans in Texas, right, like completely overriding constitutionally protected rights, right, by saying as long as it's vigilantes carrying out these things, then it's fine. The echoes were haunting, right, from this, and I guess again. I think people who listen to this show kind of know enough. When we're talking about white supremacy, we're talking about that entire structure. We're not talking just about a racial hierarchy. We're also talking about a gender hierarchy, right, that is embedded in a very particular form of, say, racialized capitalism. But anyways, we'll put that to the side. But I mean, I found that haunting to see those two things next to one another.
Right. And we've seen a number of laws since the Texas law that follow a similar, what I call the Cruikshank logic. Essentially, California did one with the guns. This is really bad, right? This makes all of us, as people who hopefully, derive protections from the Constitution, makes all of us a little bit less safe. every time it happens.
Well, and I'm also thinking about the importance of this history coming back. I'm thinking, Ian Millhiser's work on the Supreme Court at all, right? So he was the first one that he used to be on the Rick Smith show a lot, and I used to listen to him there, and I read his books and things like this, and that was the first one that disabused me of the narrative about the Supreme Court being the heroes, right? Because, I grew up, I was born 1969, right? I grew up in the wake of the Supreme Court rulings that kind of like, justified civil rights, that were seeing these kind of advancements. And so the Supreme Court was very much seen as the arbiter of justice, right? And, in the kind of capital J justice, I think is the way we'd understand it in this conversation. Sure. And so, and that has it also kind of reinforced the narrative of progress, right? That progress is always happening, that it's getting better, it's getting better, it's getting better. When Ian Millhiser and others kind of point to the fact that for the majority of its history, the Supreme Court was not on the side of the people, right? And we see this kind of like happening right here. And so, again, the echoes seem to be critical when we see an alignment of really right-wing ideology, vigilantes kind of carrying out kind of intimidation tactics in street fighting, and now a Supreme Court that is packed with right-wing radicals, right? That's all lining up in a very, very concerning kind of assembly, if you will.
That's right. Yeah, and I mean, just to echo that point, right? The Supreme Court has been sort of like, I guess, for most of its history, a safety net for white supremacy, and a safety net for the people who already have power, right? And to allow them to expand that power, And so I think about like Buck v. Bell or Williams v. Mississippi. Buck v. Bell is the one that legalizes eugenics and forced sterilization. Williams v. Mississippi is the one that says as long as there's no racist language, if it's a race-neutral language, then you can take away Black Americans' right to vote. No big deal, right? Korematsu, of course, that justifies Japanese internment. Right. The Supreme Court has a really, 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 really bad track record. We need a couple more reallys in there, right?
I was going to say, it's I'm going to add a couple.
Yeah, and so this argument that like, it's no big deal, like that stuff can't be constitutional. I'm going to be honest, like it drives me up the wall, because like the very worst things that you could think of, the Supreme Court has already affirmed, right? And is more than poised and capable to do that again, right? And so what we need to do is to prevent it from getting to them, right? And to prevent them from being able to make things even worse, right? Prevent these laws from being passed in the first place, or to override them, as I suggested, the beginning of that piece, where you're reading in the opener with the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill. We need to do something else, right? The courts are not going to save us.
Absolutely. And, one of the things, the points that you make in this piece, and I've got these notes on the side that it's not exactly your language, but one of the things that I saw as a really interesting kind of point that you bring up here is that there's a difference between giving a right to vote and a right to wield power, right? And I thought that was such a important distinction in terms of how we think about what's actually happening. So the idea, you've got this, I don't know, professional middle class liberalism version of the way that we think about change. Well, we have the right to vote, so we've got to get more people out to vote. And you even say in here, like, there's this kind of there's this sense out there that we could out organize them, right? That we could just overpower like them with people kind of that are flooding to the polls. But that assumes like this kind of equal playing field, right? The kind of mythology of the market where everybody's just kind of an equal individual player, as opposed to recognizing that the system is not necessarily set up simply to prevent individuals from voting. It's to prevent particular people from wielding power. Right. And those are, yes, they're connected, but those are distinctly different things, so that we can point to, well, look, there's a Black person on the school board. What are you saying about this? They got elected just like everyone else. But if you have a structure that is set up to disenfranchise the vast majority of those folks, to say that, yes, you can get a representative there, but you're never going to wield power over an increasingly shrinking minority that is getting all the more kind of like comfortable with violence.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, just to emphasize that point, right? Like in Jim Crow, throughout Jim Crow, like the US had elections. They had elections all over the place, right? Those elections did not matter, like not in the way that we think of sort of competitive multiracial democracy eliciting results that might empower people. That simply didn't happen, right? And so there is this possibility, right, that like we can still have elections, we still have this, many of us will still be able to access the vote. And yet that is exactly the circumstance of Jim Crow and produced absolutely devastating results.
So if that's the case, then you see this now. So again, just so that we're on the same page. So when you see the same kind of dynamic at play now, right? And call this out as saying, what's the word you use here? The situation is dire.
Dire.
So how would you sketch out that direness, if that's a word?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I guess, there's a number of things, right, that we are told we have the ability to do to keep those in power accountable to us as citizens, as voters, as residents, however you want to frame it. One is we have the right to vote, but that right to vote is being restricted, right? Okay, so we're going to have to go to box 2. All right, box 2. Well, we have the right to assemble and the right to protest, right? That's going to put some pressure on politicians, right? Those people in power. Well, that right to assemble is also being curtailed, right? Aha! But we have the right to speech and press, right? And so we can write very searing critiques of those people in power who we cannot protest in space, who we cannot, meaningfully vote to overthrow, right? And yet we also see those things being restricted, right, in the anti-CRT bills, right? And I would be very surprised if we didn't see that. Remember, the first bills, of course, only applied to, like kindergartens or whatever, right? And now we're seeing them applied to, where I teach, right, at universities, right, and every school in between, right? And I would be very, very, very surprised if we don't see that. Then they're already trickling out to libraries, right? To see that, in the public square, and that's unfortunate. But I do think, again, in terms of the historical precedents, that white conservatives have pushed as far as they can possibly go, and I would not be surprised to see that sort of being the next plane of the struggle, unfortunately.
Well, so let me get your take on this then, because one of the things that you kind of, as you're kind of pointing us in kind of a direction towards the end of this piece, right? Again, I like what you say here. While we work toward improving our existing institutions and hold them accountable, we can also embrace a culture of mutual aid and public good against which white conservatives cannot prevail, right? And you go on to kind of mention some of that history and so on. And I'm with you 100% on this. And yet, my concern is that we don't have that infrastructure, the social movement infrastructure. And I'm not saying that there was a pure time in the past, but I look at, like, this is just an example to take it. It's not specific to what we're talking about here really tonight, but it's been sticking in my mind all day, where Nancy Pelosi goes up and gives a press conference, right, about the situation in Ukraine. And she gets a question from a journalist. It says, well, look, we're seeing these COVID numbers rise, right, across the world right now, again, with this new variant, right? And we know that the funds for supporting COVID mitigation, for care, for vaccines, for, you name it, everything, that all the protocols that we've had in place, all that money is expiring. And so that's all going away. So what about that? And Nancy Pelosi's response to that was like, why are you bringing that up when people are dying in Ukraine? And the journalist is like kind of taken back and says, well, people are still dying of COVID, right? And what it said to me in that moment, right, more than the specifics of what was said, was the dynamic of the Democratic Party leadership right now, where they're kind of like, well, we're going to move on to the next thing. And I think the message from a lot of people that are getting, that are trying to address this stuff at the local level are seeing our supposed party that we have to work within this two-party system at this point, right? Having to kind of like saying, these are folks that claim to be in support of voting rights And yet when it goes away, when they lose the vote, they throw up their hands and they move on to the next thing. They claim to want to make sure that we're protected in terms of COVID, but when it becomes politically inconvenient for them, they turn to war, right? I mean, it's issue after issue after issue. We look at, okay, supposedly we have an existential crisis in terms of climate change. Where's that even on the table in terms of the discussion? And so it seems like the broad-based left, right, or at least the official narrative on the left, right, again, really broad brush here, there doesn't seem to be an agenda, whereas the right wing has an agenda, has a media infrastructure, right, has an organizational structure, so that, we watched here, right, in our own backyards, that this narrative goes national, and then the next day it's at our backyards. Right. I mean, it shows up in the school boards literally 2 days after it shows up on Fox News or shows up on the OWN network. So, I mean, given that context, I mean, pardon me if I'm a little concerned about our shot here. Right. So, I mean, and again, I don't think that, you don't paint any kind of rosy picture in your piece about like what the past was and so on. But are there certain kind of directions that you can see, like based upon what had to happen before and what we need to be getting ourselves in a position to think about moving forward to achieve these things?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's a difficult question. I mean, especially when we factor in, social media and the ways that algorithms and things can be controlled. I mean, there really is a way to keep people from disseminating information for states that are really committed to doing that, right? And so my understanding is that we see this now in Russia, right?
Yes.
And our state has those precise tools available to them, right? And so there is, a very real danger that perhaps we're all, we all turn into Sisyphus, right? We're all like in this one man struggle against this giant boulder, right? And so that's possible, and in terms of grassroots organizing, that complicates things, right? If the state, if its whole power is vested behind a white supremacist movement, right? That becomes a very dangerous situation. And so part of the reason I wrote this piece is I just, we need to not get to that point, right? And yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think part of what I hope to illustrate in the end there is like, there are other alternatives, right? And that's true. Those alternatives are really hard and, kind of, vulnerable to state violence, right? And so if we use, maybe one of the more famous examples of groups who leverage mutual aid in the Black Panther Party, right? Many of us probably, in our education encounter them as like the Black people with guns, right? But in fact, the majority of their activity was distributing breakfasts, to underprivileged children, distributing groceries to underprivileged communities, right? Providing, childcare, providing health clinics. They founded the first ambulance system, right? In Pittsburgh, right? Actually, right? Because you used to call up the hospital and they'd be like, "Oh, what neighborhood are you in? Nah, we're good," right? And hang up on you. And so we see a robust, mutual aid program there. Many of those programs that were created by the Panthers then get co-opted by the state, while the state is waging a total war on the Black Panther Party, right? And so sometimes, with my graduate students, I'll kind of, be talking about these sorts of issues and especially that type of activism in the 1930s or in the 1960s or even today, right? And sort of the thing that I tell them, is that like the fastest way to, get the FBI to knock on your door is to engage in mutual aid. And that's a bit of hyperbole, but like only a bit, right? When we think about the FBI, like assassinating people for like organizing across racial groups in the Rainbow Coalition in Chicago, right? Fred Hampton, if you're unfamiliar, like Judas and the Black Messiah, you can look it up, right? You can watch it. It's a good movie. Those things are hard and dangerous, right? And it is much better for us if we can, make, Congress people's lives just as miserable as possible until they pass some kind of voting rights protection, right? That's like bare bones basic at this point. for staving off some kind of authoritarian decline or collapse. Is it possible, though, to create sort of a mutual aid solidarity movement, especially at the local level, right? We saw something rapid like that happen in between 1966 and 1968. Just a massive growth, right, in a very short span of time. That sort of thing can happen, right? And it can put enormous pressure on the state, especially if, and I was, at an event, I don't know, a couple weeks ago or something, where I suggested, right, like perhaps the opportunity for us, as leftists and, as people who are committed to fighting authoritarianism and fascism, right, is to engage in mutual aid in the food sector, right? And to shut down like various distribution or, harvesting, processing sectors for a period of time, right? Like we don't want to create, no one wants to create like a vestige of mass suffering, right? Like nobody wants that, right? But if that is what is left in terms of like the organizational opportunity, there's an opportunity there, right? And we've learned from COVID how vulnerable these systems are.
Yeah, exactly.
That's, again, none of this is good. It would be really great if white supremacists would just chill the fuck out, right? Can I say that? I don't know if I can say it. I just did. Yeah, but like, right? Like, please stop. Just take a deep breath. I don't know. Go for a walk. I don't know, but like,
and keep on walking, please.
Please stop trying to murder people and destroy multiracial democracy. That would be really great, And so we are put like in an awkward position, right, where we have to like come up with really radical, outside of the box ideas, right? Because at the state and local level, white supremacists have increasingly organized and increasingly foreclosed opportunities. So I'm not like, oh, mutual aid is going to solve all of our problems, right? But like, I think that does illustrate like where we're at, where we may be headed, right? But then also like possible sort of last ditch opportunities that can be successful, but are not easy.
No, and I think that, this idea about mutual aid, I grew up in kind of like punk rock anarchist communities, right? So mutual aid was basically essentially like a core value belief, right? Like in a circle, right? And so, but that does make a whole ton of sense to me. And one of the things that I see happening, and it seems to be, this is not just here in Pennsylvania, but it's seeing it happening to communities across the country. I mean, even if you look at, the whole Starbucks unionization stuff has gotten a lot of traction, right? In terms of like a lot of eyes on it. I mean, even though we're just talking about a very kind of beginning movement, right? It's gotten some great coverage. Anyways, but to see that there's the best stuff that is happening right now is happening at the grassroots level. Like I see what's happening around school boards, right? And it is parents, parents and community members who basically would go to school board meetings to make sure that, the kids are getting what they need, or what are the volunteer opportunities that are coming up, or hey, this issue came up in the school, and that's how they understood what was happening in school boards. And then walking in to find them, these are these ideological hand-to-hand combat spaces now. And it's produced some really amazing, say, school board candidates that are kind of basically never thought about running in their lives, right? Had been active in a bunch of other things, said, no, we're going to run for this is important. And some organizing efforts that have grown out of that. Same things happen in the unionization efforts. But there's also a big gap between that kind of organizing level and any kind of, say, official organized, say, political organization that's happening at the, the broader level. So if you just take the Democratic Party, for example, you got, you still have this kind of consultant logic that's coming in to kind of instruct candidates how to run. When the candidates are like, no, that's not what we need to do. We need to fight these people because they're talking kind of some really crazy white supremacist stuff. And the Democratic Party is saying, well, that doesn't poll well, right? There's still that kind of gap here. And it's almost as if you have to take that leap of faith, in my mind, right? And the organizing leap of faith is to say, you know what? They can say whatever they're going to say, but we're going to organize on our own, right? That if they want us, right, the best candidates with the people on the ground that have all the door knockers, then they're going to have to listen back to us too as well. And in the meantime, we're going to have to do that deep organizing, the deep canvassing in between elections, right, to build up that kind of, the cultural and social capacity. It seems to be like anything else. We've got to exercise these muscles if we're going to be able to use them.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I just want to emphasize, like, it was Jen Psaki, the press secretary, who said that, that we can out organize, right, and we can outvote voter suppression, right, on behalf of the administration, right, because she's the mouthpiece of the administration.
Yes.
And so that's where they're at. That's not going to cut it, right? Telling people that things are already good and we're going to keep them mostly the same. Again, like when people are, I don't know, struggling to pay rent, and they're out here telling you, and even some of them are like supporting overt white supremacists, very dangerous people, right? And they're out here telling you things are not good, right? Like, all right, then we're going to need to not just message test something, right? We need to actually like stand for and propose something, right?
Yes.
And I mean, in some ways, like we actually saw that in, the 2020 election, right? With like the student loan forgiveness, right? And things like that. And with the $2,000, which then turned into a $1,400 check, that whole thing, right? But the Democratic Party for like, a few minutes, like stood for something, like really stood for something, when they had those two runoff races, right? And they had to stand for something. And then, I guess it's the donor class. I don't know, how the sausage is made. I mean, we all read the things and have some ideas, right? But, like standing for things wins elections, right? There's work involved, right? There's organizing, there's canvassing, there's all of that stuff that goes into that, right? But those things matter.
Yeah.
You can't means test your messaging. I mean, as ridiculous as that sounds.
No, but I think that it's one of those things where when you stand for something, right, and it's a vision that gets us beyond like the pit that we're in and says we've got this horizon that we're working for, that people get behind it. And then on the flip side of it, then if you're just willing to abandon that thing, right, because it's inconvenient at a particular moment, that also can double back and kind of hurt you seriously, and especially in terms of exercising power at the federal level or so on. Well, let me ask you this. I know we're running up on time here too, but so look forward here. We're heading into the kind of 2022 election, right? And I know you're a historian, right? So and not the forecaster of the future here, but as you're kind of looking forward and the kind of things that you see kind of happening, what are your expectations of what we're going to see over the next kind of several months, even next couple years, if or given the current trajectories that we're seeing?
Sure. Yeah, that's a really good question. And there's all different kinds of ways to think about this, right? But I guess the way that I'm thinking about it right now, and maybe Nancy Pelosi is helping me think about this, right, is that like in some ways, like some of us, especially those of us who are comfortable right now, we're distracted. And rightfully so. What's happening in Ukraine is horrible. It's absolutely devastating. And it's painful to watch and painful to think about, right? And yet at this very moment, right, at the local, at the state level, white conservatives are not distracted. They are out there proposing bills. They are out there passing restrictive legislation, and that's very, very dangerous. And this is just simply not the time to be, I don't know. And I guess we all do this, right? But like retweeting or sharing posts or whatever, like about Ukraine, like I think that we all know what's happening there at this point, right? It's time to phone a friend. And maybe that involves like also sending aid to Ukraine, right? Like there's things that we can do, right? But that involves us like really getting dirty, getting up to our elbows in it, and getting involved. I don't know what happens next, to be honest with you. I know historically, and of course, I'm sure we've all heard this, at least the headline, right? That like the opposition party always wins in the midterms, right? And we do know that there are reasons, in fact, to critique this administration, right? Critique their handling of COVID, critique their handling of some other things, right? I'm very concerned about the anti-inflation policy that seems totally disconnected from people's actual fucking wages, right?
100%.
We're going to actually pull more money out, and that's, we do everything backwards, right? Like we should actually just be giving, if we really wanted people to be better off, we would lend that money directly to people instead of to like banks and bajillionaires.
100%.
Right?
Yep.
Yeah. but we're entering a period, and it's devastating to think about because of COVID, right, and because of how long we've been dealing with all this shit, right? But we're entering a period where we may be belt tightening, right? And in those types of periods, again, the opposition party does well. The Republican Party has a vision. It is a white supremacist, racist dystopia, but it's a vision. And the Democratic Party, as of this moment, does not have a corresponding vision. That's not to say they don't have sort of talking points and things that they propose, ideas, right? But it's not, they don't have a culture in the way that Republicans have a white supremacist culture, right? There's a lot of infighting and things like that. If you on the other side, right, if you get Donald Trump to say something, right, 100% of Republicans are gonna be saying that exact same thing. Your OAN or whatever example, or your Fox News example, right? They're gonna be saying that the next day, right? There's a culture there. And there's a very tight political organization there. It's dangerous. It's a dangerous time, for all of us, and for many of us more than others, right? And yeah, that's that. I get, is that a prediction? I don't know, but we have to get our shit together really quick.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that as you said, the situation is dire, and I think that's important for all of us to hold on to, right? And if anything that we kind of take out, the way I've been really increasingly thinking about what's happening in Ukraine, right, is by saying is like, it's the same dynamic, right? It's the same dynamic in a different context, right? On a much more brutal scale, but the logic is identical to the kind of stuff that we're facing here. And so I see these struggles as linked, right? And I think that we're talking about the situation as dire. I think we can look at, kind of examples of how bad it can get, right? And also, to kind of look to those folks who are doing also amazing organizing, and to support folks on the local level, any chance they get. Well, listen, William, I really appreciate your time tonight. This has been a fantastic discussion. And do check out his piece. It's Fascism's Legal Phase Has Begun. Threats of White Vigilante Violence Are Real. That's over at truthout.org. And make sure you go over and check out the Activist History Review. You can check that out at activisthistory.com. Great stuff over there. William, thanks so much for joining us tonight. And man, onwards in the fight.
Thank you. Likewise, solidarity.
Solidarity, brother. All right, everybody. This is Kevin Mahoney, editor and founder of Raging Chicken. Want to thank you all for tuning in tonight, and want to make sure that you're looking ahead. Join us this Friday, where we're going to be doing the breakdown of the good, the bad, and the ugly in this week's politics. It looks like it's going to be a doozy of a week, and we'll let you know what we got coming up from next Monday. We've got a couple irons in the fire. We'll kind of let you know that in the week coming ahead. So in the meantime, you can help support the work that we do right here at Raging Chicken by heading on over to patreon.com/rcpress, and you can become a patron for as little as $5 a month. And if you are at our YouTube channel, or you're listening to it right now, head on over to our YouTube channel. If you're listening to our podcast, make sure you subscribe to the channel, like this stream, and hit that notification bell so you know every time that we go live. This has been Kevin Mahoney, and here with William Horne. Thanks again, William, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right, thank you.
All right, everybody, we're getting out of here for the night. Hope you have a good one. Spring has sprung. The solstice has passed. Onwards with the fight. Looking ahead to the primaries and the elections ahead. We'll see you soon. See ya!